If you like your stories to conclude, as I do, with, and they all lived happily ever after, then I'm sorry to announce that the book of Judges is not for you. If you like your stories, as I do, to conclude with some redemptive element, then most certainly the book of Judges and the story recounted in Judges chapter 19 is not for you. I had shared that this book is very much a man's book. Deals with bloodshed and violence and sex and women. You get it all in Judges chapter 19 and indeed the final chapters that conclude the book. Maybe that's why you've probably never heard many people preach in and out of it. And Judges 19, and I remember the very first time I read this as a 12-year-old child and reading this story in Judges 19, it is one of the most brutal and savage stories I have ever come across. A few years ago, there was an Oscar-winning movie that was called, or that is called, No Country for Old Men. It's a fictional story that chronicles the violent pursuit of a hitman seeking to recover money from a bad drug deal. But whilst this film, No Country for Old Men, is a piece of violent fiction, our story for tonight from Judges chapter 19 is one wherein the violence is all too real. And whereas the violence of the film No Country for Old Men was for entertainment, and wherein the actor who played the cold, callous killer was awarded an Oscar for his portrayal of being a killer, the story of Judges chapter 19 is not included in the Bible for our entertainment, and neither is there any admiration for any of the characters in the story. This is a kind of book, in fact, the book of Judges, I said, you really couldn't film it. It's too violent, it's too graphic, it's too gory. And the story of Judges chapter 19 left me, when I've read it, and even now, cold, angry, bewildered. For those of you who are not familiar, it's about a nameless Levite. The Levites were descendants of Levi, the third son of Jacob, of his first wife Leah. The Levites were entrusted with the care and the service of the tabernacle. This privilege was granted the Levites because of the stand that they took in connection with the apostasy of the Israelites at Sinai, in which all of the tribes joined with the exception of themselves. According to Judges chapter 19 and verse 2, the Levite, he's not given a name, had a concubine who was unfaithful to him and returned to her parents' home. The Levite wanted his concubine back and went to the parental home of the concubine to persuade her to come back with him to his remote hill country home in Ephraim. Now, on the long journey home, the Levite decided to break the journey and spend the night in the town of Gibeah. The town of Gibeah was made up of peoples from the tribe of Benjamin. In those days, there was no Holiday Inn or Hilton or motels in which you could spend the night, but rather nightly accommodation was granted on the basis of the hospitality of the town's residents. And although many of the inhabitants observed the Levite sitting in the town square as darkness fell, no one was willing to fulfill the responsibility of hospitality. The only person who took any interest in the travelers, in the Levite and his concubine, was an old man who, like the Levite, was from the country. And so he offered the Levite and his concubine a a place to stay for the night. And then the following events transpire. And I will read from verse 21 of Judges 19. So the old man, he took him into his house and fed his donkeys. And after they had washed their feet, they had something to eat and drink. While they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house, pounded on the door. They shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him." The owner of the house went outside and said to them, "No, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this disgraceful thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But to this man, don't do such a disgraceful thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man took his concubine, sent her outside to them, and they raped her and abused her throughout the night, and at dawn they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. When her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. It's not a nice story. Why would God allow this to be included? There are those of us who just want to ignore the bits of Scripture that just don't fit in with what we like. But God had a reason for allowing this story to be there. And the first reason I believe this story is not for entertainment, but the story is included in the canon of Scripture because it seeks to reveal to us the consequences for our lives and our society when we live outside of the jurisdiction and authority of God. The story is a warning to us how life transpires when God is not an authority figure. You see, outside of God, life is lived to the maxim, anything goes. We've talked about transforming lives. Judges talks about the fact that when lives do not have the authority of God, there is no transformation. Anything goes. The preface to this narrative is in chapter 19, verse 1, wherein the first sentence reads, "In those days," the commentator wrote, "in those days, Israel had no king." As a matter of fact, this statement, Israel had no king, is only used 4 times in the book of Judges, and those to the last 5 chapters of the book. The commentator commented again on this in chapter 17. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Chapter 18, verse 1. In those days, Israel had no king. As a matter of fact, the very last words of the book of Judges are these. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. You see, Judges chapter 19, indeed the entire book, but Judges chapter 19 is recorded because it highlights how mankind lives when there is no authority figure in our lives. This book is all about authority. Authority figures and the part they play in the shaping of Israelite society. Remember, the book is called Judges. It was the judges who brought authority and leadership to the people. And when the people, you remember that those 4 S's that we looked at, they would start with the sin, then they would suffer, then they would supplicate or say sorry, then they would have an authority figure, a savior, a judge. And when the judge came into their lives, then their lives transformed. But as soon as the judge went out of the scene or the authority figure was lost, they went back to sin. The author of Judges makes the comment on these 4 occasions because there was no authority figure, namely a king or a judge, to rule over the people. The people lived a lawless life. Now, I'm aware that God had said, and it was not really God's intention that Israel should have a king. But Israel, in the time of the prophet Samuel, petitioned God that she as a nation wanted to be like all other nations who had a monarchy, even though God had said, 1 Samuel chapter 8, I will be your king. I will be your authority figure. And understand this as a little aside. Sometimes God bows to democracy. Sometimes he answers our prayers, even though he knows it's not the best for our lives. And he tries to, but God even bows to the foolishness that we call democracy. We want a king, we want a king. Everybody else has got a king. We want a king, we want a king. God said they're going to tax you. They're going to take your sons into the war, take your women as the princesses in the court. Yeah, we want a king. Okay, I'll even help you choose a king. God had intended to be the authority figure in and over the nation of Israel. But Judges 19 just highlights to us, when people do not recognize authority, they will carry on anyway, anyhow. You see, the people of Benjamin, the people living in that town of Gibeah, a group of men had no internalized godly authority over their lives. That is why they pounded on the door of an old man, demanding that his Levite guest be sent out to them so that they could gang rape him. These men were not prepared to submit themselves to the authority of God. Without the authority of God, and it's a cycle, without the authority of God, they were not prepared to recognize the authority of their seniors. You see, if you cannot acknowledge God's authority in and over your life, you are hard-pressed to acknowledge anybody's authority. And so even though they were looking and were being addressed by a senior, by an elder, they had no recognition of his authority because there was no internalized authority from God in their hearts. So when the old man tried to tell them, they just said, "Give us what we want, old man." They lived according to their own dictates. There are no king. You know, when we see things in our society, it all starts with not having an authority figure within our lives. And when God is not the authority figure in our lives, then we cannot treat each other right. That's why it is said in the scriptures, you cannot say you love God and then you hate your brother. They go together. Christianity is very simple. It's about submitting all of our lives to God, to ask Him what He wants, and to guide us to doing whatever He wants. So when we wake up in the morning and we fall on our knees, we are submitting our lives, our day to God, and we are saying, Lord, you are the king of my life. You have the authority over my life. What is it that you want me to do? Who am I to be? I am guided by your authority. And it is His authority that protects and guides us. And it's simply this. Christianity is simple. If we submitted ourselves daily and truly and humbly to the authority of God, some of the issues that we have in our church, in our lives, in our marriages, we wouldn't have them, because certainly they're not granted or directed by God. Our spouse, they may go to church, but that doesn't mean to say that God is the authority figure in their life. They just go to church. But if God was the true authority over our lives, we wouldn't beat our spouses, cheat on our spouses, lie on people, gossip about people, steal from our workplaces, harbor evil thoughts, curse people out. Why? Because God is the authority. God is the one taking control, because we have submitted ourselves voluntarily out of love to His guidance. You know, last summer in the United Kingdom, there were a number of riots that broke out during the summer. It was said there was a shooting of a black man in a car in London, and then that night in the area of Tottenham in London, terrible violence broke out. The riots then spread across Britain, and there were young people in hundreds just breaking into shops and looting. And this, as I said, spread around a number of the major cities across the country. And you had camera crews just filming hooded people just breaking into shops, coming out with TVs and other goods, consumer goods, and people were being interviewed, looters, as to why they were doing what they were doing. And guess what? You know, the government said, just before I came out here, the government had commissioned bodies to look into the reasons for the rioting. And listen, most of the people, none of the people even knew the name of the person who was shot, even though they said that's why they were protesting against the system, against the law. But here's what the government discovered, and they have just begun to publish. They said the reason for the looting, or one of the causal reasons, I should say, for all of the rioting and this thing that had broken out, they said was because there was a lack of effective parenting in the lives of those young people. They arrested and jailed hundreds. And they looked at the backgrounds from which many of them had come. And they said it was a lack of effective parenting. Authority figures. Within the community from which I belong, there were figures some years ago that stated that the majority of black children born within the United Kingdom grew up in homes where the father was absent. My children were in the minority because their father was in the house. We all need credible authority figures in our lives to help guide and shape us. When I grew up in my father's home, he used to do my head in. But he always used to say, there's only one man in this house. Only one man in this house. Only one man. It used to do my head in. I'm a teenager. I want to try and rebel and do all of that stuff. Why, there's only one man in this house. I thank God for my father. A couple of Christmases ago, I think maybe it was even last Christmas. Anyway, we're having a family lunch on the dining table, and the head of the table, and my youngest son, Joshua, sits at the head of the table. So I go to him and I said, did you pay the mortgage this month? And he looks at me, what? I said, did you pay the mortgage this month? No. I said, then get out my seat. Now, I can't say there's only one man in this house because it did my head in, but that's the way I say it. our children need authority figures. And part of the reason the government, not the scripture, the reason the government said they had terrible riots all across Britain last year. Why? Because there's not credible authority figures in the home. Some people try to say, oh, the Bible is old hat and the Bible is old fashioned. Trust me. The Bible is only trying to share the best for our society and for our personal lives. My children, I didn't realize I needed it as a child, but we all need authority. We think we know everything, but we need somebody to guide us. And so Judges 19 is trying to show us just what life and society is like when there is not credible authority figures in our lives. The second reason I believe this story is included, it's not for entertainment. It is not for entertainment. But a second reason why this story is included is because it really wants to graphically show us the true nature of sin. You see, one of the things when you read Judges 19, in fact, when you read the entire book of Judges, it reveals clearly the dysfunctional, self-serving basis of relationships founded in sin. You see, Judges 19 reveals how sin affects our relationships, even to the point that dysfunctional relationships can become a culturally accepted practice and norm of society, namely concubines. Now, a concubine was, to quote from the Seventh-day Adventist Bible commentary, an inferior wife. A concubine was a wife of secondary rank. So the Levite, whose name we do not have, he would have had an official wife or wives, and in addition, he had this woman as his concubine, secondary wife. Now, concubines had limited rights of support from the man, and their offspring were publicly acknowledged as the man's children, albeit of a lower status than children born by their official wife or wives. And a man didn't have to love a woman to make her his concubine. Neither did there need to be a voluntary submission of a woman in becoming concubinage to a man. Concubinage was often involuntary, servile, sometimes involved slavery. The woman was there for the man. That's it. God never intended women to be treated as second-class citizens. God never intended for the woman to be seen as inferior, but sin messes up relationships so much that concubines became an accepted norm of society, and God, in facing this tide of culturally accepted practice and evil, sought to offer a measure of protection in law for women who were concubines. And you read about this in Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 21. And again, even in this, that you see a God who is for me, God is, you remember Jesus said, people were asking Jesus about divorce, and he said, it's because of the hardness of your heart why this stuff was given. And God even puts laws to regulate concubines, not because it's his ideal, but he says, this is the best I can work with, and let me try and protect society in the craziness that you have made it to be. Well, I don't know how many ladies here tonight, some of you may be feeling you're a bit too old for this now, but how many of you would be willing to be a concubine? Now, some of you giggle, and I'm sure nobody, whether for age or any other reason, would desire to be a concubine. But let me tell you what happens in the United Kingdom amongst a number of women in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They would say, I would never be a concubine, but yet they will take the even lower status of a modern day mistress. You see, as a mistress, they don't even have the rights and status of a concubine. As a mistress, they have to keep their relationship hush-hush. Now, I'm sure this doesn't happen in Australia, but it happens in the UK. And when I had somebody come to my office just recently and just pour out their heart, it was on this same crazy issue, where her husband just announced to his wife that a child that she had been in church with and had played with, that was his child, 7 years of age. It's crazy. That's how society is, white authority figures. And what the Bible, Judges 19, is saying, can you not see how crazy life is? Can you not see the self-serving nature of sin? Sin affects our relationships. Judges 19 says it's going to graphically show you how sin affects our relationships to the point that you have concubines, the Levites, and nobody bats an eyelid. Women were regarded as inferior to men. That's sin. That's why an old man, in trying to pacify the sexual perverts, could say, I will give you my virgin daughter. What craziness is that? The poor girl in the house. Hey, what? Oh no, don't leave him alone. It's a man's world. But I'll give you my virgin daughter. I'll give you his concubine. You can do whatever you want to them. Sin has just messed up relationships. Sin had relegated women to being nigh on disposable. And when you read on beyond this story, it gets worse than this. And so that's why the Levite could just throw out his concubine to the men to be terribly abused. Why? Because sin had messed up the relationship and the regard and understanding between men and women, so much so that they were regarded as secondary. And when you look at Judges chapter 19, you see how relationships deteriorate to the point because sin, and in English, in a three-letter word, its middle letter is I, and it just reveals how sin is only concerned with its own interests, with its own lusts, with its own regard. The feelings of others, the interests of others have no place in sin. And that's all you see in Judges 19. And God says, I'm including this story to show you graphically how horrendous sin is. It should make you want to throw up, but that is sin. This Levite traveled many kilometers to persuade his concubine to return home with him. Oh, I can imagine him giving all sorts of sweet words and telling her how precious she is to him, blah, 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 blah. But then as soon as some danger and predicament comes, he pushes her out. And then you see the whole coldness of sin, that in the morning, when he's then going to continue his journey, he then steps over the woman who's dead at the threshold of the door and says, get up, let's go. It is an awful story. The woman was dead. The shocking murder influenced the Levite to take drastic action. They're no heroes. There's nobody who comes out of this good. Judges 19 says he cut up her body and cut it up in 12 parts and posted her body to the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel, including the leader of the offending tribe of Benjamin. This was an action to call to enact justice. And the recipients of this gruesome parcel were expected to respond to the clarion call for justice. And then the latter chapters of Judges recount that as a result of him posting out this woman's body, a civil war ensued against the tribe of Benjamin. 83,000 lives were lost. The Benjamite tribe was nearly annihilated. And whilst we might say there was some measure of justice, there is no justice in this book. All you see is the overriding practice and results of sin. You see, outside of the abiding presence of God, Israel, the Holy Land, was no country for old men. Israel was no country for young men, young women, or anybody. Where we are from, some of us hold very dear and very precious where we come from. Our ancestry is very precious. In the UK, I was asked, "Where are you from?" And I would say Leicester, the town of Leicester in the Midlands. And folk would say, no, where are you from? I said, I'm from Leicester. No. Where are you from? I said, Leicester. No. Before that. But I was born in Leicester. No, yeah. Before that. I'd say, okay. My parents were from the West Indies, the island of Antigua. Viv Richards. Oh. So I went to Antigua as a child. I'm walking down the street in Antigua. The kids are shouting, "Englishman! Englishman!" I said, I'm not English. So I don't know where I'm from. My grandfather is Irish. Sweeney. Fully Irish. 100% Irish. So now I claim my Irish ancestry. I went to Ireland to lead a revival meeting. And I said, do you know any Sweeneys in Ireland? Oh, yes. Many Sweeneys. And I said, innocently, tell them cousin Ian has come home. They looked at me like I was crazy. No, you ain't one of us. So to this day, I don't know where my country is. Some of us came to Australia as immigrants to pursue better opportunities. Some of us were sent here, or our ancestors. Britain sent the best it had here. You know, my parents did not leave Antigua for the United Kingdom on the basis of the weather. They were seeking opportunities. They were seeking money. They were seeking something that Antigua did not have to offer. But one of the things, and I've shared this, but one of the things that gets to me is how, when you are not living in your home, how great home is. And I would hear people of my parents' generation talk about back home. Oh, back home is wonderful. Back home is, back home. And I would say to myself, because I wouldn't dare say it to them because they'll beat me up. But if back home is so good, what you doing here? Australia is a great country. And Aussies are justifiably proud of their country. But I made it a point to watch the news this morning. And yes, I saw that the West Indies were 490-something for 9 in the first test against Australia. But there was a police chief in Sydney, and he described some parts of Sydney as depicting a Martin Scorsese gangland movie as a result of shootings and stabbings. We may be proud of where we live. We may be proud of where we come from, but trust me, this country, and I'm not speaking about Australia, I'm speaking about whatever country you call home, trust me, this is no country for old men or old women or young men or young women. Because as beautiful as we might say our country is, trust me, it is still rampant with sin. And every time we watch the news, whoever's bringing it to us, it could be ABC, BBC, or Al Jazeera. What it will chronicle is a decaying society. This is no country for old men, for old women, for young men or young women. I don't know where I'm from. And I'm kind of glad, actually, because the only country I am looking forward to living in, the only country that I truly want to say is my home, is the one in which the Bible tells us of. And when I was growing up, my parents would play music that was just not for me. But I'm so glad they would play that music because the words made an impression in my mind. And what it was with Jim Reeves, I don't know. Oh, they loved their Jim Reeves and their Charlie Pride and their Pat Boone. Some of you know what I'm talking about? Used to do my head in. But I'm so thankful to God they played that stuff. Because I still can hear Jim, and I'm sure it was Jim or Pat, I'm sure it was Jim, where he would sing about a land on the faraway strand. 'Tis a beautiful home of the soul, built by Jesus on high, where we never shall die. 'Tis a land where we never grow old. You know, as my father now, he suffers with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And I remember my father, just a strapping man, and now he's reduced. And he used to say to me, once a man, twice a child. And yes, the UK, they are giving him care and protection. My mom, bless her heart, she's elderly. She's struggling to care for Dad, and Dad's having to be in residential care, and we're wrestling with all of those issues. It's part of the reason, not the only reason, but part of the reason I want to go to another country. That country that Jim Reeves and Pat Boone and others sang about, in a land where we'll never grow old. I want to go to a place, and God is preparing a place where we won't have news channels that just chronicle the decay of our society. Where we won't worry about and have fear for the safety and protection of our children. My daughter is making her way on a train in a few hours' time from a musical event back home. And trust me, as a father, I'm concerned to make sure she gets home safely. This is no country for old men, old women, young women. And I'm longing for that sweet by and by. Because God has promised that there is a land that is fairer than day. And by faith, we can see it afar. For the Father waits over the way to prepare us a dwelling place there. It's my prayer that wherever we meet again, it is our determination through our transformed lives in Jesus that we will meet in the sweet by and by. Let's live lives and share Jesus Christ so that we all can live in a country that God is preparing for us in the sweet by and by.